Hey everyone, Synthetic Future here and welcome to the unboxing of the Zhiyun or Zhiyun wireless transmitter 2.0. So in this video we'll cover the most basic things, so let's start with a unboxing. So here's the unit itself. It feels very robust and it's about 160 grams. It mounts underneath the gimbal, so it will compensate for the weight of the camera, which is actually quite neat. You get a pretty big set of cables with this unit. This has been a complaint with the V1 version of this specific unit. So you get a Type-C to Type-C cable. You get the HDMI Mini to HDMI Micro. HDMI Mini to HDMI Mini. And these were the cables that were missing in the V1, which were a lot of complaints about. It's nice to see them here. Last but not least, it's struggling a little bit, is the HDMI Mini to HDMI Type A. So a few more USB cables if it wants to focus, Type-C to Mini USB. Here's a Type-C to Mini USB. The other one was micro. Here's a Type-C to Type A. And here's a USB-C to USB multi, which Sony uses. Aside from that, you get some things you need to attach the transmitter. So there's a few screws, 4 screws, and a little hex wrench. And you get a little adapter to place on a hot or a cold shoe. Now if we back this back up, you also get a little manual. In my case, this manual is in English and in Chinese. Now this details the installation process, but I will also show you the installation process right now, accompanied by some music and some on-screen instructions. So let's get into the installation of the wireless transmitter 2.0. So now that we have everything set up, it's time to do some range testing and some latency testing. Now, because I don't have a 100 meter field, I'm just going to do this indoors. I am in a European house, which means it's all concrete. And what I'm doing here is I'm going to the next room. So that's the room behind this closet the camera just passed. It's a solid concrete wall. And there's also a big closet with a mirror between it on this side and on the other side of the room, which are both completely filled as well, one with clothing and one with electronics, so it's a pretty big barrier to pass. On the left you see the feed of my Nikon, on the right you see the feed of the gimbal camera, and on the bottom you can see the screen capture from my phone. Now, as you can see, there is a bit of latency, and when you move it, it will be a little bit delayed, but overall the image quality seems good. So this was the part of the test where I decided that just being one room over with a thick concrete wall and two closets wasn't enough to break the connection, so I'm now moving upstairs. So effectively there's going to be a ceiling in the way now. As you can see, there's a little bit of a breakup. This is a pretty rough testing situation already, because right now the monitors of my PC are in between the phone and the receiver, and there's at least two walls and a ceiling. So this is pretty extreme testing situation, and just to stress test it a little bit more, I decided to move downstairs as well, which is even a little bit worse because I'm further away from the room itself. And here I'm back in the hallway. And now I'm moving downstairs. And this is where you will see the signal starting to break up. There it is. And ultimately it will lose connection. It still allows me to control it for a little bit, until ultimately it breaks down. So overall I would say in these testing situations, which are pretty harsh, I mean normally you wouldn't have walls in between yourself and your gimbal. So this is pretty much the worst case testing scenario, I would say. And it holds up pretty well in these situations. Now there are a couple of latencies we need to talk about. The way I synced this is that I synced the two cameras together with a snap, and as you can see here I synced my phone feed with my Nikon camera. Now the first latency is the control latency, and it takes about 3 frames. Now this isn't the best measurement in the world because it's only 30 frames per second footage, but 3 frames is about 10 milliseconds of latency and control. And in the image transmission it seems to be about 9 frames in this scenario, which is about 30 milliseconds, which is pretty substantial. I also noticed that the stopping time, so from the moment I let go of the control to the gimbal actually stopping to move, is roughly 1 second, which is pretty long. And this is with fairly low gimbal speeds. But you can see it's pretty easy to overshoot things if you use this as a controlling mechanism. Now the one thing I sadly can't test is it transmitting to a screen, because for that you would need the transmission receiver, which I don't have. I would like to have one, but it's a bit out of budget to buy that as well. So unless Zhiyun sees this video and thinks it's a good idea for me to test one, it's pretty unlikely I get one. Now, how does this compare to other wireless transmission systems? I honestly can't tell you, because this is the only wireless transmission system I have. If I compare it with the wireless transmission that the Sony does itself, it seems fairly comparable, to be honest. Now, of course, this does have the added benefit of being able to control the gimbal as well. Sadly, with the Sony A7 II that I have, I can't control the camera from the Zhiyun software. which is a bit of a shame, but that's probably due to Sony's APIs and not allowing that. So that's a bit of a thing to check out. There's a big compatibility sheet on their website, which is pretty comprehensive. So yeah, just check that out. If that's a need for you, check if your camera supports it. The one thing I do kind of dislike is that they have a cold shoe mount plate, which is pretty nice. But in order to use it, you need to screw it to the mounting plate of the transmitter, of which you only have one. And if you want to mount it back on your gimbal, you will have to remove the screws and screw it back into the gimbal, which is a bit annoying. It would have been nice to have the option to buy a separate plate, so you can have one with the Hotshoe holder and one on your gimbal. So you can easily switch between having it on your Hotshoe and having it on your gimbal. That would have been a nice bonus, or at least a nice order option. So let's take a look at the app and all the options this gives you. Now it is important to note that you can't change the settings while filming, so that's an important little note. If you keep your eye on the right top corner, you can see the scopes, which you can change. You can also set it to a classic histogram. You are looking at the feed of my phone right now. So this is what the camera image looks like on my phone. If you go into the image settings, you get a few more settings, including some clipping modes. You also get a zebra right next to it. There's some highlight clipping modes. So you can now see the highlight and the shadow clipping. Next to that, we have color filters, red, green and blue channels. Also monochrome. You can actually load in LUTs from here. And you get a zoom option. You have a few grid overlays you can activate. There's also a focus peaking. Now I did notice that this focus peaking is a little bit less sensitive than my Sony's own focus peaking. So it's a little bit more generous. In general though, it does seem to do a pretty good job at finding the edges and showing where the focus is. That's not 100% flawless, but it's still a pretty good guideline, and I will show a little bit on the focus later on with a manual focus lens. As you can see, it's doing a pretty decent job keeping everything in focus in the red highlights. Now you can't change the highlight colors, so that's something to keep in mind. Here you can see the highlight and the shadow clipping in action. And with the zebra as well. As the exposure changes, it's pretty responsive. It doesn't take very long to adjust. So that's overall a very nice feature. You also have some safety borders you can activate. And you can flip it. It only does flips on one axis. And you can delete the overlays if you want to have a cleaner image. It will remember the options you've activated if you disabled the interface. Now for this little test I used a Pentax 50mm 1.7 manual focus lens in conjunction with the focus motor. So on the top right here you can see the focus motor controls. As you can see, it's a pretty smooth operation. It seems fairly responsive, pretty easy to get some in-focus shots with this setup. Now, of course, moving around and focusing things at the same time is tricky. Notice, by the way, that the tele and wide angle are correctly configured here. And using this 1.7 is fairly tricky. It's also a bit soft, which is actually how this lens just happens to be at the 1.7 aperture. And here you can see you can do pretty small adjustments. Now the gimbal is sitting on the desk, so there's less shake of me holding it. As you can see, the edge focus does seem to be fairly accurate. Of course, when you're zooming in a lot with a somewhat softer lens, it does look a bit soft, of course, but still doing a pretty good job. Now the controls themselves, I would say, are a bit tricky to use. Now if you were just using your phone, so if you have a second person controlling it, it would be fine. If you're using the gimbal, you're better off just using the scroll wheel thingy on the gimbal itself. So another function they offer is the option to follow you. No, don't mind my rather scrappy looking hair. I'm using my iPad here. There's also support for the iOS system. And I'm using a manual focus lens here. So there will be no focusing. This is actually in a pretty dim room. I think I was using something like f2 here on the 50mm lens. Now if you're going to move very fast and very erratic, it will lose track, but as you can see, if you are somewhat obscured, it can still follow you. Here it lost track, but also grabs. Once I get into the right spot, it manages to find me. Now this definitely works a bit better if you're a little bit further away, especially with the 50mm. But here you can see moving behind the microphone and the pop shield. Not a problem at all. Moving down and moving up. As long as the speed isn't too high, it does a pretty good job falling around. Now here it does go wrong and it manages to stick to this piece of IKEA furniture for some reason. I'm unsure why, so I disable it and I point it back to my face. So what you're looking at is a screen capture from the iPad. So this isn't the full quality of the camera. This is just the wireless feed. Here I obscure my head to see to what extent it matters for the following. Still seems to follow pretty well. And once you start to move closer, you get a lot of out of focus as well. It doesn't seem to bother this system at all. Now, one peculiar thing, and I don't know if it happened here or a little bit later. I think it's here. It decided to start tracking my iPad instead of my head, which is a little bit weird. So, yeah, that's a thing that could happen. And a thing that might have to get improved, and here it decides to latch onto the microphone stand for some odd reason. So this system isn't perfect. Now I wouldn't recommend using it in a cluttered situation like this anyways. And I also wouldn't advise to use it in this dim of a light, but still the fact that it does somewhat work is pretty impressive. Yeah, and this is the sort of stuff where it gets pretty confused. So with a little bit more of a careful movement and a little bit more of a background separation, it does seem to do a pretty decent job. Until you move into a spot where it thinks it needs to grab on to something else. So occlusion is a thing, but I'm not all that surprised. Here you can see me turning the iPad. Still tracking. So yeah, it's a pretty cool feature which I'm going to try to use a little bit more in future videos, because it does seem to work pretty reliably and it is quite fun. So that brings us to the end of this video, and this has been a pretty long video, and I think I did a fairly good job covering most of the things you need to know about the transmitter unit. Not everything, but probably most. And if there are any questions, you can always leave them in the comments, of course, and I will try to answer them. I'll probably do a follow-up video or two just about the gimbal itself and some features of the gimbal. But for now I want to keep it mostly to this TransMount transmitter thing. So what can I say about this unit? The unit itself is a very nice unit. It's nice and sturdy. It's pretty compact. It's not going to be in focus. There it is. That's thumbnail material. Something like that. That's how YouTubers do it these days, right? Anyways, a very nice little unit. It's about 140 euros, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah. So if I were to compare this, I would probably compare it to a Atomos Shinobi. Now, this isn't the fairest of comparisons, because first off, the Shinobi has a screen built in. This clearly doesn't. And the Shinobi is also a calibrated unit. This and the smartphone app aren't. At the same time though, this unit will let you use the transmission wirelessly, which the Shinobi cannot do. And this also gives you control of your gimbal remotely and gives you the follow mode and stuff like that. And for me, I would say that's pretty valuable. And that makes this unit very valuable by itself. It's a good value proposition. So if you're planning on shooting a lot of footage and you want some way of remote monitoring and controlling especially, this could be a very good option. Now, some things that are a downside for this system is the amount of control of your camera is going to depend on your camera model. So with my A7 II, the remote control of the camera is rather limited. So I can't just change the ISO and that sort of stuff remotely. I don't know if that's a Sony problem or not. I did send a mail to Zhiyun asking him about it. I haven't got a reply yet. So I can't say if that's the issue. But that's a bit of a downside for this particular system. Now, if you combine this system with a follow focus motor, it's a very nice way to be able to use vintage lenses and have a pretty good way to check focus with the focus peaking mode this offers and the control of the motor. And all that for me does make it a good system. Now, I'm no professional filmmaker and I don't have any comparison materials at hand. This is the only unit I have. That's the only gimbal I have. And the camera you're watching at right now is the only camera I have that's capable of using this system at least. So I can't give a completely unbiased opinion because this is simply the gear I have, but I still wanted to showcase you what sort of thing you can expect from this gear. If we're talking about things that could possibly be improved about this, I would say it's mostly the app, which could use some more features. One of the things I would be very interested in is like the option to automate movements. That would be very nice if you could program in a sequence of movements or points and the gimbal can follow those. That would be very cool. That's more of an app complaint than a complaint about the transmission unit itself. The transmission unit itself, I don't really have any complaints so far. If I come across anything, I will let you know. But so far, I must say for 130 euros, I don't think you can do much better, really. And the range is good. The app functions are adequate. And the follow system, I'm going to have to test how reliable it is. But at least in the demo I showed here, it looks pretty promising and usable. So if there are any questions about this little thing, I should use the other hand, let me know in the comments below. If you don't have any questions, thanks for watching this far. I appreciate people that are interested in my content, of course, and if you could leave a like, that would be extra nice. So that's it for now, and I'm going to wish you a great day. See ya.